COP29, a turning point for climate action. The world watches as leaders gather in Baku, Azerbaijan, for the 29th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The stakes are high. Our planet is warming, and the consequences are becoming increasingly dire. COP29 represents a crucial opportunity to turn the tide and forge a path towards a sustainable future. The time for talk is over. We need concrete action. This year's conference carries a particular sense of urgency. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense, from devastating floods to raging wildfires. Sea levels are rising, threatening coastal communities. The impacts of climate change are no longer a distant threat. They are happening now, affecting millions around the globe. The science is clear. We must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to avert the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. To achieve this, we need a rapid and equitable transition to a low-carbon economy. COP29 must deliver on this ambition. Understanding COP, a history of global climate negotiations. COP, or Conference of the Parties, is the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC. Established in 1992, the UNFCCC is an international treaty with the goal of stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. COP meetings have been held annually since 1995, bringing together representatives from nearly 200 countries to assess progress in dealing with climate change. These conferences serve as a platform for governments to negotiate and agree on commitments to reduce emissions, adapt to the impacts of climate change, and provide financial support to developing countries. The UNFCCC recognizes that developed countries have a historical responsibility for climate change due to their higher emissions over time. Therefore, a key principle of the Convention is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, acknowledging that developed countries should take the lead in combating climate change and supporting developing countries in their efforts. Milestones of hope, from Kyoto to Paris and beyond. Over the years, COP conferences have yielded several landmark agreements that have shaped the global response to climate change. These conferences have brought together nations, leaders, and activists from around the world, all united by a common goal: to address the pressing issue of climate change. The Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997, was the first legally binding treaty to commit industrialized nations to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. This agreement set the stage for future climate action, establishing a precedent for international cooperation and accountability. The Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015 at COP21, marked a historic turning point in the fight against climate change. It was a moment of global unity, with countries coming together to pledge significant efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change. This landmark agreement brought all nations together for the first time to commit to undertaking ambitious efforts to combat climate change, with the goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. This ambitious target reflects the urgent need to address the climate crisis. The Paris Agreement also established a framework for transparency and accountability, requiring countries to regularly report on their progress in implementing their commitments. This framework ensures that nations remain committed to their pledges and allows for global monitoring of progress. While these agreements represent significant milestones in international climate action, the journey is far from over. The path ahead is filled with challenges and requires continuous effort and collaboration from all nations. The commitments made by countries are still insufficient to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and implementation remains a challenge. It is crucial for the global community to intensify their efforts and take bold actions to ensure a sustainable future for generations to come. The gathering storm criticisms and challenges facing COP. Despite some notable achievements, COP has faced criticism over the years for its slow pace of progress and the lack of ambition in the commitments made by countries. Many activists and experts feel that the urgency of the climate crisis is not being matched by the actions taken. Critics argue that COP meetings often become bogged down in bureaucratic procedures and political wrangling, hindering the ability to make bold and timely decisions. The complex negotiations and the need for consensus among a large number of countries often lead to watered-down agreements. One of the most significant criticisms is the gap between the commitments made by countries and the actions needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This gap is seen as a major failure in addressing the climate emergency effectively. The emissions reduction targets pledged by countries under the Paris Agreement are not ambitious enough to achieve this goal, and some countries are not on track to meet even these inadequate targets. This lack of progress raises concerns about the future of global climate efforts. Another challenge is the issue of equity and fairness. The disparity between the responsibilities and capabilities of developed and developing countries remains a contentious issue. Developing countries, which are often the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, argue that developed countries have a historical responsibility to provide financial and technological support to help them transition to low-carbon economies and adapt to the effects of climate change. This support is crucial for ensuring a just and equitable transition for all nations. Section 5. Climate Finance. The heart of the matter at COP29. Climate finance is a critical issue that will be front and center at COP29. It is the lifeblood of global climate action, enabling countries to implement their climate plans and meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. Developing countries need financial support to transition to clean energy, adapt to the impacts of climate change, and address the loss and damage they are already experiencing. Without adequate funding, these nations cannot build the necessary infrastructure or develop the resilience needed to face climate challenges. The issue of climate finance is central to the principle of equity and fairness that underpins the UNFCCC. It ensures that those who have contributed the least to climate change are not left to bear the brunt of its impacts alone. Developed countries pledge to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries. This commitment is crucial for building trust and fostering cooperation between nations. However, this target has not been met, and the current levels of climate finance are far from sufficient to meet the needs of developing countries. The shortfall has significant implications for global climate efforts. The failure to deliver on this promise has eroded trust between developed and developing countries, creating a major point of contention in the negotiations. This trust deficit must be addressed to move forward. COP29 will need to address the issue of climate finance with a sense of urgency and commitment. The stakes are high and the world is watching. Developed countries must deliver on their promises and scale up their financial contributions significantly. Only then can we hope to achieve the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. Innovative financing mechanisms, such as carbon pricing and green bonds, should be explored to mobilize additional resources. These tools can provide new avenues for funding and help bridge the financial gap. Section 6. Navigating the Labyrinth, the new Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG. A key focus of COP29 will be to make progress on defining the new Collective Quantified Goal on climate finance. The NCQG is intended to replace the $100 billion target after 2025 and will set a new, more ambitious target for climate finance from developed to developing countries. Negotiations on the NCQG will cover a range of issues, including the overall size of the new target, the sources of funding, and the balance between mitigation and adaptation finance. Developing countries are pushing for a target that is significantly higher than the $100 billion, arguing that their needs are much greater in light of the escalating impacts of climate change. They are also calling for a more equitable sharing of the burden, with developed countries contributing more in line with their historical responsibility and capacity. The NCQG has the potential to be a game changer in mobilizing the financial resources needed to address the climate crisis. Section 7. Discord on the road to action, disagreements and roadblocks. However, reaching an agreement on the NCQG will not be easy. There are significant disagreements between developed and developing countries on key issues, such as the definition of climate finance, the eligibility criteria for receiving funding, and the mechanisms for monitoring and reporting. Developed countries are often reluctant to commit to specific and binding targets for climate finance, citing concerns about their own economic challenges and the need for greater transparency and accountability from developing countries in the use of funds. These disagreements have the potential to derail the negotiations and undermine progress on climate action. Building trust between developed and developing countries is essential for overcoming these roadblocks and reaching a meaningful agreement on the NCQG. This will require open and transparent dialogue, a willingness to compromise, and a shared commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone. Section 8. Hopes and expectations. COP29's potential to shape our future. COP29 has the potential to be a turning point in the fight against climate change. The decisions made in Baku will have profound implications for the future of our planet and for generations to come. The world is looking to our leaders to demonstrate the courage, ambition, and political will needed to address this defining challenge of our time. Success at COP29 will require a collective effort. Governments, businesses, civil society organizations, and individuals all have a role to play in accelerating the transition to a sustainable future. We need to move beyond rhetoric and take concrete actions to reduce our emissions, invest in renewable energy, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. The time for incrementalism is over. We need transformative change across all sectors of society. The stakes are too high and the consequences of inaction are too dire to accept anything less. Section 9. A call to action. Our shared responsibility in a changing world. As we stand at this critical juncture, let us remember that the fight against climate change is not just about reducing emissions or securing financial commitments. It is about building a more just, equitable, and sustainable world for all. It is about protecting the planet that sustains us and ensuring a livable future for generations to come. The decisions made at COP29 and beyond will shape the course of human history. Let us rise to the challenge with the urgency and determination that this moment demands. Our planet, our future, depends on it.